Sir Christopher Findlay, a honorary professor of Crawford School of Public Policy, Australian National University. So, Professor, you have 30 minutes time to do the presentation, and that will be carried on by the discussant. We have Ms. Jane Drake-Brockman, a senior visiting fellow, Institute for International Trade and executive director, Australian Service Roundtable. So, floor is yours, Professor
Good, thanks.
Christopher. Yeah.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to join this very important conversation today. Let me see if I can share my screen with you. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, looks perfect.
Good. So this is a paper with my colleague Wenxiao Wang, who's also here with us today. What we'd like to do is make the case essentially for more focus on the service sector in the development of these strategies of transition to high income status. So what we want to do today is say a bit more about why services matter. We want to talk about some recent developments in ADB economies. We want to talk about some of the other developments going on in terms of the way that services are delivered and the way that global value chains in services are emerging. And then, having argued that there is an opportunity, I try and talk about some of the constraints on capturing that opportunity, which are related to policy and to the challenges of managing reform to capture those opportunities. So that's our plan. Why services matter? The literature has been pointing for a while now to some of the challenges that manufacturing faces as being a source of both employment and productivity growth. These include the processes of automation, reducing the labour cost share of output, the adoption of robotics, shifting the nature of work in manufacturing, the challenges for economies to enter global value chains. These add up to some challenges to the traditional advantages of moving down a manufacturing route. At the same time, there seems to be emerging a lot of new opportunities in the services sector. One of these comes from the evolution of manufacturing itself and the use of more contracting in the servicification process, which is a positive for manufacturing productivity as well. In the process, markets for services are deepening and extending and creating opportunity for new entry. So that's one part of the process. But on top of that, there's pretty significant technological change going on. Traditionally, there was a concern about services that they could only be effectively delivered through face-to-face interaction, but digital technology is breaking some of those constraints. It's also possible to offer services through across borders through the formats of so-called telemigration. And the nature of the technology, the scope for innovation, the opportunities that the new technology offers to operate at scale in services means we'd argue that services are gaining some of the pro-development features that were traditionally associated with manufacturing. These include their tradability, as I mentioned, the scale and the innovation now possible. So in this context, we think it's very important to consider a new development strategy and to contrast what might be called the old model of factories, equipment and technology transfer, catching up to the frontier and so on, with a new model which is more focused on the service sector, what's happening there, the role of human capital in promoting the growth of the service sector, and the contribution of cities to service sector performance. It's a new orientation, but there is the possibility, we think, that economies can directly export their comparative advantage without first building manufacturing capabilities. That's, we would say, a pretty big shift in the way of thinking about development pathways. It's not. We'll keep it simple today and say that this is the old model and the new model. Perhaps in the conversation time we can talk a bit more about the interaction between the two models. But for the sake of our first presentation today, let's keep it simple and say, let's think about a new development strategy which has this services orientation. In the paper, having discussed some of these points, we move on to look at some data that might indicate the extent of this opportunity. Is it a real thing? What is happening in international markets that might create these possibilities for entry? Let me show you some of those pictures from the paper. It's been observed for some time now that services trade has been growing faster than goods trade. That's sort of indicator number one. Yes, services trade was pretty significantly affected during the COVID period, but this is total services trade. We'll come to different forms of delivery shortly, but it's also services trade's also made a strong recovery. On the right-hand side is some indicators of growth of services exports by different types of economies, and we observe there the history of pretty rapid growth of services exports for developing economies as well as for the developed economies. So despite this growth in trade, it's interesting to try and figure out how to normalise that to try and get some sense of how significant it is. Yes, trade in services might be growing quickly, but how does it matter? To what extent does it matter? And one way of doing that is to look at the export share in GDP, which is what we do in this figure. So this is the share of exports in services exports, total services exports in GDP by different categories of economies. The ADB economies are the solid lines and dots. The rest of the world is the open circles. So that you see that for both the developing ADB members and the developed ADB members, the services significance in GDP, services export significance in GDP has been rising, more so for the developed economies. But those shares are still relatively low compared to the rest of the world. So that leads us to ask the question, what's the potential here? Does this indicate that there might be scope for doing even more in terms of the growth of services exports? Another interesting development in the services trade has been the shift in the modes of supply. So as a quick reminder, the services can be delivered in the traditional classification as these four modes: cross-border supply, consumption abroad, which is when the customer travels, the commercial presence, when the foreign firm sets up in the host economy to deliver the services, and the movement of people, about which we've just had an interesting discussion. So the old story was that the dominant mode of delivery of services internationally was through mode 3, that is through the establishment mode. And that's the top two lines in this figure. That's the breakdown of services exports by modes of supply for ADB members. Again, they're the solid lines and the solid circles, and the rest of the world, which is the open circles. So you see the two lines at the top, they refer to mode 3. They've traditionally been the dominant mode, as I mentioned, but there's been an interesting shift since COVID in their relative importance, because go to the next two lines, that's mode 1. So that's the cross-border delivery, has been significant for some time and really picked up after the COVID experience. The other modes are relatively less important. The mode 2, the people movement, customer movement mode, took a hit in the COVID period and hasn't really recovered its share, and likewise with mode 4. So there's a very interesting story, events going on around the use of the cross-border delivery mode 1. And one of the drivers of that is the access to digital technology, which really reduces the costs of trade in this mode. There's a lot of different channels by which that could be the origin of that outcome. Reductions in communication costs is one. The standardization and automation of transactions it is another. The use of platforms to help people get together is another. Bandwidth allows the delivery of complex services without physical. Better bandwidth allows delivery of complex services without proximity. Payment systems are important, and they're facilitating these transactions as well. Plus the development of new instruments for transparency and for the development of trust between people trading at a distance. So this shift towards mode one is significant, and you can understand where it's coming from. This change in technology, I think, amplified by the lived experience of people in COVID, trying out different ways of doing things. On top of that is the impact of artificial intelligence, and we spend some time in the paper talking about why artificial intelligence is able to reduce these trade costs further, and it's likely to add significant changes to the patterns of trade, be highly productivity advancing, creating new types of services and also new occupations as well. But there's going to be a few requirements for success, including infrastructure, and we'll come to the drivers of competitiveness shortly in this presentation. So let's focus then on what's called digitally deliverable services. These are categories which could be, not necessarily are, but could be delivered cross-border, and they're listed across the top of the slide here. The data shows now for digitally deliverable services, the exports by modes of supply for ADB economies and the rest of the world, ADB economies in solid circles and the rest of the world in the open circles. So you can see that the top two lines refer to mode 3. There is still a significant role, but generally declining a role for FDI in these service categories. But there is strong growth in the actual digital delivery of these services, as the two purple lines, the next two down, are showing. Again, if we normalize this, in this case, by looking at the share of digitally deliverable services in total services exports, what's the experience for the economies of interest here and benchmarked against the rest of the world? Well, the share of this category in total services exports for the ADB membership is relatively low compared to the rest of the world. And again, that leads us to ask the question: what's the scope is there potential for improving that performance and capturing some of these opportunities? We can split that out by development level, which is also an interesting thing to do. It shows that these data show that again, solid lines ADB members, open circles the rest of the world. These figures show that the digitally deliverable export shares, while they're rising in the ADB member economies, they're still relatively low compared to the rest of the world, where you compare appropriately across levels of development. Third dimension of the delivery of services across borders we wanted to talk about. So we've talked about the general growth of the services trade. We've talked about the modes of delivery. We've talked about digital delivery in particular, especially digitally deliverable services. We wanted also to talk about value chains. Traditionally, if you talk to someone about services and value chains, they'd say, "Oh, yes, services are really important. They're marvelous, critical, if not critical, supporters of the value chains in goods in relation to logistics, transport, finance, communications, or all those sorts of things." And that's absolutely true. And so you see a lot of services which are embodied in goods exports for that reason. It's been an important mode of delivery, actually, of services across borders. But our interest is in the global value chains in services themselves, and we really want to point out, we really want to stress that services themselves are produced in global value chains, and appreciating this and understanding it and thinking about the ways of entering these global value chains is going to be important if these new opportunities are going to be grasped. So these same inputs like logistics, finance, communication, and so on are critical for the delivery of services across borders. I mean, just take an example like tourism, for instance, and you can immediately see the extent to which the relevance of transport, all sorts of other services, and digital technology in the tourism activity. And just as there was in goods, I think there are very significant benefits of taking this global value chain perspective on your services strategy. The value chain approach facilitates the entry into the chain. You don't have to provide the whole chain. You can specialize and find a place in the chain that suits the core competencies of an economy. Participating in the chain facilitates the transfers of technology, and getting into business and participating in the chain also helps develop the skills of the workforce, and once started, those foundational skills are the basis of the transition to another level. It is possible to provide some indicator of participation in global value chains in services. So this is participation in services, and we're using the same sort of indicators as people are familiar with when they look at participation in goods value chains. So on the left-hand side, there's forward participation. The picture for the sort of ADB membership is that forward participation is growing, but it's relatively low compared to the rest of the world. Backward participation is pretty stable, both in all economies, but backward participation is much higher in these data than is forward participation, which is a bit interesting and something we can talk about later if you're interested. So what have we got? We've got fast growth of services trade. We've got new technology creating opportunities for new forms of delivery. We've got signs of that happening already through the growth of digitally deliverable services. We've got evidence of presence of global value chains in services and extensive participation in those value chains, and that being a good way, potentially a good way to get going in terms of this new services development strategy. But there are impediments, we would say, and what we look at in the paper then is, what are the policy impediments? In the first instance, we look at policy impediments. We do come to other drivers shortly. We look at the policy impediments to launching this strategy. And the place to start, I think, is the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index. A quick averaging across the various economies show that overall it's higher in the ADB membership than in the rest of the world. Left-hand side of this figure. On the right-hand side, it's particularly high in developing economies compared to developed economies. that's a pretty standard story. So we're going to focus on these STRIs and how they might be an indicator of issues. But I do want to say you have to be careful in these in the interpretation of these indices. I mean, there's nobody. I'd say there's nobody in the world who loves STRIs more than me, but they're a tool, and they're fundamentally a tool for, I think, for benchmarking. So it's of interest to look, what's the STRI for our economy, and what is it for others, but why is it different? I think that's the first question to ask, not to launch into a position that economy's got a more restrictive regime, and that's a problem. There are all sorts of drivers of these STRI outcomes, and sometimes their origins can be in, say, concerns about institutional capacity, plus a genuine concern about a market failure issue, leading to a decision that all that we can do at this stage is pretty severely restrict trade in that particular service because we're concerned about those market failure problems. Or on the other hand, you might say, well, some economies got a very low STRI value, and gosh, that looks like a good outcome, but that may actually be an indicator of insufficient level of institutional development and regulation, because there are lots of issues in these services markets, and for them to operate well, there's often a degree of regulation that is useful. So what you're really interested in is the degree to which policy is more restrictive than necessary. However, the STRI is a marvellous place to start. It's a very rich data set, very important sets of information, and it's a good thing to begin with, including not much has changed, though, over time. In the measured indicators, the breakdown of the various categories, there's the OECD categories are on the right-hand side, and there's a bit of movement in relation to mode 3, which is the top one, but not so much in other areas. So there is a level of restriction, but not much is happening. So that looks like a good talking point. Why is that the case? There's certainly research to indicate that it's worth giving this some attention. Some people have done some econometric analysis on the impact of the STRIs as they're observed on trade. Increases in the importer STRI certainly reduce services imports, and we think that's probably an explanatory. The level of the STRI is probably explanatory of the backward participation. So if you were going to engage in a GVC-led development strategy, I think you'd want to look at your STRIs on the import side and think about whether they are unnecessarily restrictive and how they could be reduced. But interestingly, some of this research also finds that STRIs in exporter countries also reduce trade, reduce exports. So the thought there is that a more restrictive regime is reducing competitiveness and leading to lower trade volumes as well. So worth paying attention to is the conclusion and a critical part of developing a strategy. A point that's been made very strongly recently, especially by the OECD, is that, and again, you can use the STRI to track these issues down, is that it may not be so much the level of the index which is the issue for trade and more integrated markets and productivity growth and moving to higher income. It may not be so much the level which is the issue, but the variation in regulation across economies. So, in principle, it's possible for two economies to have a very similar score, but have very different regulatory regimes. And the OECD's done nice work digging down into the extent to which that happens, and it's come up with measures of regulatory disparity that are certainly worth having a look at. And those measures, as we review in the paper, have been linked to trade costs as well. So higher disparity, higher divergence leads to higher trade costs. These outcomes are not necessarily protectionist. they're often just due to different ways of thinking, different historical paths or institutional development strategies. But an important point is that as trade costs come down due to other drivers, such as digitalisation, which I just spoke about, remember the 6 channels by which digitalisation might reduce trade costs, this divergence issue becomes more important. So it's an important thing to focus on, and since the focus of this meeting is about areas of cooperation, I think you can see a rich agenda of things to do of mutual benefit in dealing with these regulatory divergences. Another useful indicator that's been developed is the extent of restrictions on digital trade. The concern is that the levels are on the right-hand side. Overall levels are on the left-hand side. I'm sorry, the orange for the ADB and the blue for the rest of the world, and they're broken down by economy groups on the right-hand side. So the concern is that the digital restrictiveness index has risen, plateaued since COVID, with some more gentle increases more recently, but pretty significant variation in patterns across economies. So if the argument is that there's a new opportunity for a development strategy with a services focus, this is going to involve participation in trade, this is going to involve participation in GVCs, this is going to involve digital delivery and more use of Mode 1, then the growth of restrictions on the use of Mode 1 is a problem, and something else to keep talking about. So we've talked about some policy impediments to pursuing this new growth path with a services focus. How can we make progress then on dealing with these policy issues, which I've been suggesting is inevitably going to involve pretty significant cooperation effort? Two things on this slide. At the left side is a summary of what we've been using recently, including in a series of activities in the APEC process. What we've been using recently is a model of the drivers of competitiveness of the service sector. So what we've been arguing is that at the centre of any economy's service-orientated development strategy should be openness, dealing with issues in the STRIs, dealing with the issues that the clever use and interpretation of the STIs indicate as sources of restriction. That's certainly at the centre of things, but there is a number of complementary activities which are worthwhile considering, and these complementary activities are also impacted by, have a positive two-way relationship with openness. So these other activities are following. A good innovation ecosystem is a help to drive competitiveness and adjustment to the openness that occurs. And a good innovation ecosystem which is globally connected is also more likely to be a successful innovation system. Secondly, there's an agenda related to regulatory reform and responding to the issues of restrictiveness that emerge. And that agenda also involves dealing with regulatory divergences and has a high level of international cooperation involved. The third component is a focus on human capital, developing the skill sets required for the chosen position in the global value chain. And fourthly, as mentioned a couple of times already, is the quality of the infrastructure and the capacity. You can imagine if we're going to have an increasing importance of Mode 1, then the infrastructure has to be able to accommodate that change. Now, these topics, so two things. This way of approaching the competitiveness question, I think, has been very constructive in our experience so far. People appreciate the idea that it's not just a matter of liberalisation; it's a matter of a package of things that needs to be that is valuable to be done, and they recognise the issues of coordination across agencies that involves. But it's a strategy of openness plus. The second thing is, I think the origin of this framework is actually with the ADB, because it came out of work, and I think Jane was involved in this too, work that looked at which sorts of economies, what were the characteristics of economies which were successful in digital delivery of services. Second suggestion in the paper, and we spent a bit of time on this, is how actually to make progress in a particular sector. And we rehearsed some ideas that Bernard Hoekman and I had a go at presenting about the value of a platform where the private sector officials could gather to identify bottlenecks in services trade. The idea would be to organise this platform across the global value chain so that a number of economies would be involved, and points of critical impact could be discussed, identified. This would be a place, for example, to talk about those issues of regulatory divergence and what to do about them. We'd encourage the idea of experimenting with one of these platforms and picking you'd have to start with a pretty well-defined value chain, but identify a chain which people regard as important and run an experiment on how this platform might work and what progress you could get from it. So in conclusion, we think that there is scope for a services-orientated strategy, that services trade offers a pathway for ADB economies, that there are new avenues for growth, productivity growth, and prosperity. But the foundation of this is digital transformation. The digital technology has fundamentally changed the economics of services trade, expanding its reach, reducing traditional barriers and creating opportunities. But policy barriers persist, if not are increasing. And that's the place to start. Regulatory divergence within that category of issues, we would say, is the priority for attention. We think that a comprehensive package of policy change is valuable. So that means initiatives across not just openness, but a number of complementary fields, but it would be implemented in the context of a high level of regional cooperation, especially on regulatory alignment, and in the context of global value chain operations. It looks like ADB members have some potential to significantly increase their global presence in services, leveraging these three things: leveraging the digital transformation, leveraging policy reform, and leveraging a comprehensive approach to the development of new policy. And we think that in that context, it's possible that promoting regional trade in services can contribute to productivity growth and to income growth. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor. Now I'd like to bring on Discussant to discuss on this paper. I'd like to invite Jane Drake-Brockman, a Senior Visiting Fellow, Institute for International Trade and Executive Director, Australian Service Roundtable. Jane, floor is yours. So you have another 15 minutes to discuss on this paper, and then we'll go for a Q&A.
Thank you very much. I see this as a really important paper because it reminds us how important it is to focus explicitly on the untapped productivity and high income growth opportunities which are clearly present in the services sector. So the paper draws on a great deal of recent literature to elaborate the nexus between development on the one hand and greater openness in services trade, higher levels of productivity and deeper integration in global and regional value chains. And it also presents the latest data, and in particular, the new series released 2 months ago by the OECD, which updates the trade and value-added data series that they operate, but adds in the by mode of supply breakdown, which is new. And there has to date been very little analysis that has yet emerged. So from my point of view, the paper does us all a great service by doing a first ever analysis for the ADB region, for all the regional members, showing the aggregate trends, because that new data set, while it's experimental and very new, has a lot of important insights that we haven't been able to really get at before, partly because, as Christopher's explained, the balance of payments doesn't include mode 3, and having mode 3 in with the other modes in the same diagram is something we can now more easily do and have a consolidated picture. So the paper breaks the analysis down quite comprehensively between the developed and developing country members and between the sub-regional groupings. It calls for a significant policy response and identifies the key ingredients, most of which I agree with, and I'll conclude with a couple of questions for the authors. But most importantly, this paper also takes the time to really patiently explain the current changes underway in the services sector. And frankly, the paper is more moderate in its language. Perhaps I'm a bit less patient, but I want to say that the changes identified in the paper are really no less than dramatic. They're revolutionary, because digital transformation of the entire economy is prompted by and led by these very changes in the services sector. Now, this is not an entirely unsung story, but sadly, it's a very frequently forgotten one. Services trade as a development path was something that was highlighted as long ago as, well, maybe 15 years ago, if we go back to Aditya Matu's first paper on the service revolution in South Asia. That was 2009. The crisis resilience of services trade, Borchert and Matu, World Bank 2009. Ghani and Karas, the service revolution, 2010. World Bank, and then work that the ICTSD did on services value chains, 2012. And the trade and value added data set of the OECD first emerged also in 2012, where we first saw the services share in global exports double from that 23% to 45% in trade and value added terms in 2008, and that's up over 50% now. So actually, even before the document that Christopher mentioned, the ADBI was among the first to highlight some of the regional policy implications behind this empirical evidence, with a publication in 2012, along with the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, Services Trade, New Approaches for the 21st Century, which actually led to ultimately APEX adoption in 2015 of a 10-year roadmap about to be renewed at the end of this year to develop regional services competitiveness. So it's important, I think, that we're back here today with an ADBI venue and audience. Now, the World Trade Report of the WTO didn't pick the issue up till the following year in 2013. And by 2013, by the way, there were already as many as a quarter of the world's least developed countries, including in the ADB region, we had Cambodia, Laos, Nepal, Samoa, Vanuatu, all of them net services exporters. LDCs then, which were net services exporters. And the notion of a services development path was already becoming a recognised and potentially realistic option. Well, more recently, Richard Baldwin showed that there had been a dramatic shift in development paths. This isn't just an imagined story, it's a real story. In 2020, there were 65 lower middle income countries that were following services export-led paths, compared with 18 of them still pursuing manufacturing-led paths. And for upper middle income countries, the figures were 88 were pursuing a services-led approach and 19 still pursuing a manufacturing-led approach. And then when we go to the high-income countries, it's 91 in the services category and 42 in manufacturing. So there's clear evidence there that it's in the emerging and lower middle income category where these new opportunities for growth might be greatest. But I want to come back to what might hold this story up, and it's effectively exactly what Christopher said towards the end himself, that the increasing barriers in digital services trade could prove a big binding constraint on this services-led development path, and it is something we must pay attention to. So really it wasn't until more recently, 15 years later, that the global digital transformation really brought services back to policy front and centre. And with both digital services and e-commerce more generally, gradually achieving higher priority status in international trade conversation. And as Christopher did note, it was really the ADB that first explicitly set out to try and test the Baldwin hypothesis in their 2022 publication, Unlocking the Potential of Digital Services Trade in the Region. So it is important that the ADBI take note of this work that Christopher and his co-writer have completed. The OECD TIVA by mode of supply data series is groundbreaking in one sense. I mean, the ADB has its own input-output data, which is different but doesn't yet break down for mode of supply, and there are some new insights here. We also have some other data sources that are coming on stream, the ESCAP's Digital Integration Index and the OECD's new Digital Integration and Openness Index, the Indigo Index. And if we have time, I'd like to come back to the Indigo Index for a moment. But for now, I really want to repeat Christopher's message that trade and services has been and remains on a long-term growth trajectory. It's in very marked contrast with recent global trends in goods trade. And this is not going to change. It is not because of transport. It is not because of travel services and tourism. It is because of this category called other commercial services, which are now more than 60% of total services exports, growing 4 times faster than trade in goods, with sustained 8% per annum growth through, it's actually for the entire last 2 decades. The top global growth performers are computer services, construction, intellectual property, insurance, financial services, professional and business services. And that is the growth that is driven by technological change and digital enablement. These are the business services, they're often called producer services or B2B services, intermediate services. These are the services that enter every sector of the economy and deliver the bulk of the productivity impetus, which I'll come back to in a moment. But I just want to say that, just to give you this data, the WTO in 2023 estimated that global exports of digital services had nearly doubled from 2014 to reach 54% of total commercial services exports. They had also doubled in value in the previous decade, 2005 to 2014. What this means is that the annual average growth of 8.2% way outpaced not just goods at 4.8%, but other services export growth as well. There's no doubt that this is the most important global trade growth story today, and a growth story which the ADB region must not miss. And one of the most important things I feel in this paper is that the figures, it's very dense empirical graphical work there, and it is showing how, while some regional ADB members are contributing to these trends, it's worrying that some countries are seemingly missing the boat and detracting from the trends. But also, the paper shows how with the right structural reform efforts and focus in particular not on the barriers to entry so much as the domestic regulatory barriers, including to competition, can, if reformed, enable those opportunities for further growth to be reaped. So the biggest, I think I just would at this point say I have a question for the authors, and so perhaps put them on notice when I talk about worrying signs. I personally find figure 9 and figure 10 very worrying. Figure 9 to me seems to be bad news. We have the revealed comparative advantage of developing members of the ADB declining quite rapidly in modes 1, 4, and 2. And in figure 10, I don't think it's a good story either that the ADB countries are displaying less backward linkages in services than in the past. I would have thought that it's incredibly important for efficiency and competitiveness to import and use as intermediates the world's most efficient services inputs. And why cut oneself off from them? That seems to me a problem, that laggardly growth compared with the rest of the world. And secondly, the forward linkages didn't look good to me either, the trends, just too slow and not enough of it going via mode 1. So all I would really want to add is that, because I know time's up, but the most recent 2025 WTO staff paper by Beckers and others is saying that these growth trends are not going globally to change. The global share of services trade is forecast to rise to 37% by 2040, with the productivity and trade gains projected to be highest, as I've said, for low-income and lower-middle-income countries, for whom total share in total trade could consequently increase to 10.6%. So I'm assuming that the moderator wants me to wind up my comments at this point. And so I will leave it there, but would welcome some further commentary by the authors in the Q&A, particularly on some of the productivity issues they've raised. Thank you.
Sorry, Raj, you're on mute, I think.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much for your wonderful comments and discussing the paper, Miss Jane, and then also Professor Christopher for a wonderful presentation. So maybe I think we can utilize like a few minutes as a feedback or as a reflection from Professor Christopher on the points that Miss Jane has raised, and then like after that we can open the floor for the Q&A so we can get more questions from the floor. So is that okay, Professor?
Sure, and my colleague Wen Xiao might have some other observations on the data, especially figures 9 and 10, which Jane points out are important in the paper. But Jane, thank you so much for the reminder of the history of thought on this, and I'm embarrassed to say there's a couple of things in there that I should have remembered myself. In terms of data, in terms of the way we talk about what's happening, I think we talk about digital delivery, but there's another cut, which is the one that you stressed, which was the role of intermediates and business to business services, and we should look at the data in that perspective as well. If the organisers will give us the space to do that. Yes, I did reflect, especially after other hearing reports of other events, including the recent WTO meetings, that there is some other interesting work which explicitly links these developments to productivity, and that's a linkage that we wave our hands about in this paper, but we can make a bit more explicit, which will be helpful to make the point about how services-led strategy can contribute to income growth as well. But through you, Chair, can I ask Wen Xiao if she's got any comments on the response to Jane's points about the data and the figures and the data sources?
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Jane, for the excellent comments. I think one thing I could add to your concern about figure 9 is actually, if actually we just say that especially for the developing ADB members, they are just have a quite repeat decline in the RCA in terms of service recently. But if you link this to especially in the other mode, but if you link this to the figure 13, which actually we divide the digital trade restriction index by the different development level of ADB members, you will see that for these developing ADB members, actually we can see that their digital STR are rising quite quickly recently. And I think that might can partly explain why, in terms of the model 1 and the other models, their, RCA are declining. And this actually corresponds to your opinion that, the policy restrictions matters in terms of the development of service trade, especially for the ADB developing members. Yeah. And also, actually, for the figure 10 about the forward participation index of the ADB members, and we actually we have done the individual level analysis, and we haven't included it here. And basically, actually, the lower level of the forward participation mainly comes also from the developing ADB members. And for the developed ones, as we said, like Australia, New Zealand, their forward participation are higher. But for most of the developing ones, their forward participation in terms of the service value chain are quite low, actually. Yeah. And because here we take the average, so basically they are lower than the rest of the world. Yeah.
Good. So thank you, Jane. To summarize, there's some literature we'll pick up, including the recent WTO staff paper. There's some other cuts on the data that we'll look at. There are some other data sources which we haven't used, which is including WTO data on what's actually digitally delivered, which we could look at. But and there's the topic of productivity, which I think we have to talk about some more. But we'll interact with the project managers to see how much we can include in our brief. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. And now I'd like to open the floor for the Q&A. Like if we have any questions, concerns, feedback to Professor Christopher's presentation. If for the panelists, please raise your hand. I can see somebody raising the hand. Yeah, please ask your question, turn on your mic and go ahead and ask the question. So it is from Dr. Arif.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Findlay, for a very interesting and very thoughtful presentation. I was just wondering about one thing. Throughout the presentation, you are talking mostly about exports and services. I was just wondering, how about the import sides of it? Is there no interesting story from that front? And what would be the implication of it in terms of promoting services trade in the region? Thank you.
Shall I respond now, Chair?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, absolutely, Arif. Good reminder. The good exporters are the good importers as well. That's been an old story in goods trade, and I think it's a story in services trade too. And it goes to what Wen Xiao was just talking about, the extent of backward integration in the value chain. If you're going to kick off this sort of strategy and you do as we suggest, adopt a value chain perspective, then it's going to be about finding your position in the chain, having the policy regime in place to allow you to import the things that you're not so good at, add value to them, and then re-export them. So we can certainly look at ways of telling an import story, although we've got our space constraint to manage.
Yeah, like I think to the point that Dr. Arif has mentioned. So like as I was listening, so one of the so we have Dr. Dil also asking the question, but like before that, let me just like add on to that question. It's like, for example, import might be very good for several landlocked countries like Nepal and Bhutan, because like for instance, like the agriculture input, which could be a fertilizer, right? So that really needs a proper import channels, and like that is really linked to the productivity. And I think that angle should also be a kind of good aspect to look at.
Yep. Good reminder about landlocked countries. In fact, we've been involved just recently in some work on agriculture in Mongolia, and these stories are very relevant to the development of an export strategy in Mongolia.
Yes, Dr. Dil, please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Professor Findlay, for these wonderful presentations. Actually, one of my questions was to what Dr. Raja was asking. I come from Bhutan. Yeah, we are a very landlocked country. They are a double landlocked country. We had this discussion yesterday. Like under that circumstances, how do we navigate and integrate ourselves, landlocked countries, into the global arena? Yes, I mean, like maybe for service sector, particularly in IT and all that, is possible, but in terms of goods, what are your suggestions for us? That's one. And second thing is that you have already slightly touched upon it. Like, there is like geopolitical fragmentation. There are lots of challenges that we are facing, and everybody's worried as to how the world will evolve, over next couple of years. So what are your advice for us? I would really want to hear from you on these two fronts.
Yeah, so I think the value chain way of thinking is a good way to start, and the sort of the platform idea that we've proposed in the paper, I'd really welcome your comments on whether that would be an operational way of identifying what the critical bottlenecks are to success, and what are the regulatory reforms or the regulatory alignments that would be important to free up the flow of services that support the productivity growth and export activity of other economies. So basically, I'm suggesting some benchmarking work as the first step.
Yeah. So I think we have already reached to the time, and I think time is already running out. So with this, I'd like to once again thank Professor Christopher Findlay and Miss Jane Drake for really having a good presentation and discussion, and also for the bridging the questions by the panelists. Thank you so much. So with this,
thank you.
yeah, with this, now I'd like to carry on the program.